All right, so first and foremost, a huge thank you to all of you for joining us today. I'll turn on my video for this. If the bandwidth starts to get shaky, if somebody can just give me a quick chat warning that the connection isn't stable, and then I'll turn off my video if that happens, so that we make sure that the voice and the screen share are the priorities on this. But I'll leave on my video if it manages to behave itself today. You never know from one day to the next. But I'm so pleased to be here with you guys today and to be talking to you about careers in library publishing. So the background on this in terms of who I am and what this particular project is all about. My name is Catherine Skinner. I'm the executive director of the Educopia Institute, which is a small nonprofit that works in the academic library space, as well as public libraries, museums, archives, and other cultural memory organizations. And we build networks and communities, and we try to link people together and really help a lot of the digital oriented librarianship and curation activities get into rhythm at the field level by bringing people into collaborative relationships. So we've found that in things like library publishing, when every library is trying to invent the wheel for itself, it takes a long time for things to get moving, and you never really manage to scale things up as well as you'd like to. But when a number of libraries come together, or when a number of practitioners come together and share information, it makes it much easier to bring things up to larger numbers of institutions doing really, really great work. So that's just a quick little bit about me and Educopia. In terms of this project, this was an IMLS funded project that was undertaken by the Educopia Institute in collaboration with the Library Publishing Coalition, which is a really cool membership organization that serves this area that some of you may know about. You'll hear a little bit about it today, but I promise this is not a sales pitch for the Library Publishing Coalition or anything like that. IMLS funded us to do a project that was all about trying to spread the word about what library publishing is and how to do it for a lot of different types of students. So we built an open curriculum. We're going to give you access to a separate set of that that's a little bit more curated, but there's also a big multi-purposable set that a lot of instructors are using now to teach in iSchools and in MLIS programs, and also in a lot of continuing education settings. And so this curriculum is really intended, A, to be open, to be something that anybody can have access to, and B, to really help to spread the word about this new and really thriving subfield of librarianship. So what I'm doing today is taking and distilling down some of the things that we've done over the course of the last 2 years in putting together this project and this curriculum, and really focusing in on what does library publishing even mean, and what do librarians do in library publishing? If you want to get a career in that space, what are some of the job titles that you might see, and what are some of the characteristics that they might be looking for in new employees? One of the things that I really love about this space of library publishing is that because it's one of the newer spaces in librarianship, it is incredibly open to newcomers, and getting credentials isn't, it's not a high bar to entry or high barrier to entry. And so part of what I'm going to be trying to do over the next hour is just bring some of the basic information to you, and then give you lots of ways where you can build on that information, both using some of the curriculum, and then also, if you're really interested in this area, using me and using Melanie Schlosser, who was the co-PI on this project, the co-principal investigator on this project, and who is the facilitator for the Library Publishing Coalition. And we'll interview you, we'll talk to you, and if you are really interested in moving in this direction for a career, we'll match you up with programs that we know are doing things that match some of the things that you're interested in, and help you build some of those first relationships that make it so much easier to get your foot in any door within librarianship or any other field in the world that we live in. So with all of that said, as preface, Let's jump in. Let's see if I can make my screen behave. There we go. So the outline of what we're going to be talking about in more specifics is, first and foremost, what is publishing? What do we mean by that term at this point? And what in the world do libraries have to do with publishing? And then we'll move a little bit deeper into what are some of the most common functional roles that libraries play. So what are the common activities that a library publisher or somebody who's working in a library publishing unit might undertake? What does the job market look like? And the quick foreshadowing is it's fairly open. And there are a lot of different job titles. And if you don't know this area, you might miss those job titles and those opportunities, which is why we wanted to make sure that we did this. And then finally, if you do want to become a library publisher, if you want to explore this field a little bit further, what can you do to get started? And as I said, we'll have lots of ways that you can do that. So starting off, what is publishing and what do libraries have to do with it today? Don't get lost on this slide. So don't try to read this, and please don't be overwhelmed. I promise you're not expected to be reading this at the same time as you're hearing what I'm saying. The definition for library publishing has been set in a number of different places. What you're seeing here is coming from the Library Publishing Coalition, which again is a membership organization that operates in this space and really bridges a lot of the different library publishing programs together, and lets them learn from each other and exchange information and build shared documentation and things like that. So one of the first things that the Library Publishing Coalition did was they built this definition around what is library publishing. And so they defined it in a couple of different ways. The first piece here, what's important for this context, is that it's about the creation and the dissemination and the curation of scholarly, creative, and educational works. So that can include a whole raft of different things. It can include things like open textbooks, but it can also include monographs. It can include just digital publications. It can also include some print publications. But in that broad space, it's about helping to create, helping to disseminate or get the stuff out there, and then help to make sure that the stuff is both findable and also preservable. So that curation term is really about those two functions. Some of the things that we really point to in library publishing as a maturing area of practice is that there's a formal production process that is involved in this. It includes really looking not just at works that already exist and that have been published in the past and kind of digitizing those and moving those into some kind of a digital form. That's not really what we're talking about here, though that is sometimes done in library publishing environments. What we're talking about is original work. So things that have not been published before that are brand new, whether that be, again, a book, a monograph, or a journal, or other types of publications. And we'll talk a little bit about those types of publications in a moment. It really is about helping authors get new ideas out, and then doing so in a way that's predictable and that has a kind of good housekeeping seal of approval piece to it. So that certification is really important. Being able to put in a lot of cases, academic branding. So, being able to say that Purdue University's library press is the one that is actually putting this publication out is important and tells the reader something about what they're about to read and what level of sophistication it should have, what level of buy-in it has from the broader academic community. Not everything that we're talking about today is going to be academic library centered, but I will say that there is a strong leaning in that direction. A lot of library publishing has grown out of the academic sector. It is starting to happen more and more in public libraries as well. So it does happen on both the public side and on the academic side. Finally, in this last paragraph, the things that we've highlighted, it's all about really building on the core library values that have been here for centuries at this point for librarians. And on that traditional skill set that we've had both in physical environments and now in more digital environments. one of the things that makes publishing in libraries different than in other spaces is that there is a heavy leaning towards open access, or providing things for, for free or as close to it as possible. And there's a remarkable, I think, desire to really remove the barriers of high price tags and difficult workflows and processes for authors, so that both the reader and the author is more likely to actually be able to get the scholarship or the whatever it is that they're writing out. And then we're also seeing in libraries that, as compared to like university presses or commercial publishers or other groups, library publishers have had a really strong willingness to embrace informal and experimental forms of scholarly communication. So really playing in digital humanities spaces, helping scholars and researchers and students build websites that are, really capitalizing on audio and video and mapping techniques and all kinds of things to tell a story, to really bring things to life. Those are all very near and dear to the library publishing space. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to know how to do all of those things in order to get your foot in the door for a career in this area. But those are some of the things that library publishers tend to wind up involved in. So why do libraries publish? The first one here is something that I really want to highlight for y'all. So the most important driver of library publishing has been campus-based demand. So for years, and really steeply increasing with the moment that everything really started going more and more digital, so in the 2000s roughly, the demand from campus clientele, so your faculty, your staff members, your students, both undergraduate and graduate, started to skyrocket, where people had ideas that they wanted to get out, and they had projects that they wanted to undertake. Sometimes it was founding a new journal in interdisciplinary studies or in an area that really didn't have a whole lot of attention yet. So those kind of new and emerging spaces. Sometimes it was a book on a topic that presses wouldn't have thought would sell, and not basing all things on sales numbers is a good thing, because sometimes the things that need to be said whether it's going to sell or not. So that those folks that were really feeling the pressure from publishers and feeling shut doors from publishers, they started coming to the library and started saying, what can you guys do with us to make sure that these things that we're creating get out? So I'll give you a couple of examples. One is Jeffrey Bennington, who is one of the big scholars in a very narrow, very esoteric field in critical literature studies, but a really big deal guy. And he came to us at Emory University when I worked there back in, this was right around 1999. And he said, look, I opted out of publishing with the big publishers. I published with Oxford, I published with University of Manchester, I published with all these different folks, and publishers always got in the way. They slowed down my work. I have a huge following. I don't have to do that. So I've been producing PDFs and I've been putting them up on my website. And then he said, can you help me get them into the card catalog for the library so that people can actually find it? And so sometimes it's people who have already been kind of renegades. They're out there, they're doing it. They know that for whatever reason, they either don't want to work with a publisher in the traditional publishing space, or in other cases, they have not been accepted by publishers in another space and are determined to get their work out there. Sometimes those people will come to a library and say, help, like, what can you do for me? And the library is a helper. I mean, this is part of what I think is a defining characteristic of libraries and librarians. And so it shouldn't come as a huge surprise that when people came in with those questions and those queries, many libraries started providing services. And then as that continued to happen all over, not even just our country, but all over the world, these practices started to come into being. And that really is one of the places that, or one of the things that made libraries start publishing. Libraries choose to publish in part because it does broadly align with our values. We're already into things like metadata, making sure that we know how to describe the objects that we are caretakers for. So there are a lot of things about the way that we need to catalog and mark up different components that really do lend themselves to the area of publishing. And so a lot of those skill sets that librarians have had, you know, again, and have been developing over centuries, make a lot of sense all of a sudden, especially in the digital space, as something that we can pretty quickly get up to speed on and offer some pretty sophisticated services on. Some of the other things that I'll highlight here, you know, faculty and student research is really big, and the student piece of this is huge. There are a lot of students who have really innovative ideas, and there are a lot of students who are from underrepresented backgrounds or who are in areas of study that are not particularly popular, or smaller subfields and things like that, who have great ideas and need to get them out. And libraries have been phenomenal partners for those folks. And I think we've been motivated to help in many cases when nobody else was stepping up to that plate. Creating a more equitable and just system of scholarly communications. There are a lot of writings that have come out of the scholarly publishing world, specifically from library publishers, that are pointing to how great the disparities are in scholarly communications and how much is produced by the same dominant folks that have been in positions of power for centuries. And it is absolutely the case that the way that the structures of publishing work values some perspectives more than other perspectives. And one of the things that library publishers very deliberately are doing is studying that. They're writing about that, and they're trying to break that up. And so there is more attention to underrepresented voices, minority voices, and also to things like accessibility, making sure that, that what we're publishing corresponds to the best ways that you can get materials out there, not just for the able-bodied or however you want to say that, but also for people who have issues with hearing or with their eyes or with other things that interfere with their ability to just get to a lot of the scholarship and publishing that is out there. And then finally, it is definitely, you know, I'll use the word renegade again. The library publishers are not in this to make a profit. And a lot of the commercial publishers absolutely are, even in the scholarly space. And so providing an alternative to mainstream publishing is something that a lot of library publishers really do approach with a passion. And so there's a lot of activism in library publishing, which I think lends itself to new voices in ways that are really helpful. Some of the characteristics of library publishing, I won't spend much time on this slide because this is some of what I already said, but the things that I'll point to here that again are a little different from what you would find in either a commercial or even a university press space most of the time, not always, is just a real leaning towards partnership. So there are a lot of collaborative efforts that are happening in the library publishing space that are harder. It's not that university presses don't want to do this, or even the commercial entities don't want to do this. It's that it's harder for them to do it. And libraries, because the profits aren't a part of the system, it's much easier for us to collaborate across and really do interesting things in partnerships, whether that be something like Emory University publishing. They have a really robust digital scholarship publishing space. They've partnered with UNC Press, which is a much more traditional publisher, not super traditional, but much more print-based still in what it does. They've collaborated to do digital components of editions that are open source, open access, but that also are, you know, rooted in a UNC Press branding, which is really powerful for both partners. So there are a lot of partnerships like that that exist as well. And then pedagogy is a big part of this as well. So open textbooks, as many of you have probably come into contact with, but I shouldn't presume that. One of the big movements, I mean, again, all of this has some social movement ties to it. There's a lot of activism here. And one of the movements in scholarly communications right now that library publishing has had a very, very big role to play in, and I think will continue to have a big role to play in, is that student textbooks are insanely expensive. It's one of the things that, again, is a big barricade for a lot of people being able to get the education that they want and that they deserve. And so providing professors and researchers with ways to build their own textbooks and then provide those as open resources rather than charging $80 a shot for, you know, a textbook that is relatively esoteric in many cases and is required reading. So, you know, giving ways to lower the cost of education and then providing those openly so that anybody anywhere in the world can get to these and use these is a big piece of this too. So that pedagogical piece is very important to library publishing. So just a very quick rundown of a few things that libraries publish. And I'll say that at the end of this presentation, we're going to be giving you a link to a Google Drive where lots more information is. And so if any of these pieces intrigue you, you will be able to dive deeper later, but I can only do so much in an hour. So, so in terms of some of the things that libraries publish, just real surface level description. One is what you'll hear called institutional repository materials. And for those of you who are already working in library settings, this institutional repository is probably a term you've at least come into contact with before. Typically, these are systems where content is stored, and it's often your unique content that is produced by somebody within either a campus setting or sometimes within a public library or a museum setting. So in academic realm institutions, a lot of the institutional repository materials are things like electronic theses and dissertations, which for most institutions at this point, the only way you can turn in your master's thesis or your dissertation is electronically. So it's no longer like when I went through my PhD program, I had a stack of paper that was bigger than I can make my hands be in this window. It was like a tree and a half died to allow my dissertation to be printed out, you know, 5 times or whatever ridiculous amount of times I had to do it and give it to the office. That's not the way it's done anymore. It's almost all electronic, and it's required to be that way. And so you have to have a place for trustworthy retrieval of that material. Because my dissertation, that bound version, still sits on a library shelf at Emory University right now. But 100 years from now, if a student wants to get to a dissertation, student, a scholar, whoever, wants to get to a dissertation or a thesis that was written 100 years before and it was in electronic form, we have to make sure those things are still going to be available too. So institutional repositories allow that space for theses and dissertations. Journal articles that are published elsewhere. So again, one of the big incentives for library publishers, and you know, very much in this kind of social movement environment, is that there are some commercial publishers that really put paywalls, is what we call them, you know, toll walls, where you can't get to content unless you pay for a subscription. So it means that unless you are a subscribed library user whose library has a subscription to, say, Nature, the huge Springer journal for science, then you can't get to it. And in order for your library to pay for that, it's insane amounts of money. I mean, we're talking millions of dollars a year that are going into these bundled packages for a lot of these journals. And so one of the things that libraries have been focused on over the last 30 years really is trying to figure out ways to help researchers move a copy of what they publish in these journals that can only be accessed if you pay for it into an open institutional repository environment so that people can get to it. Other things that go into institutional repositories include technical reports, white papers, so things that are less formal writings that come out of projects and things like that. And then there are a number of different platforms that are used for this. So again, this is very digitally oriented. And what you see listed here And you'll have access to these slides after, so you can actually click on these and go and look at these different platforms and get familiar with them. These are some of the platforms that you will hear library publishers talk about and that you'll see in a lot of library publishing environments. And each one comes with its own set of drawbacks and liabilities, as well as its own set of benefits, one of which is marked with these asterisks that you'll see at the end of DSpace and Fedora, Samvera, and Islandora. Those three are open source, Content DM, Digital Commons, or not. Other things that libraries publish. There are a lot of things that are very similar to what you'd see in a university press. And in fact, libraries and university presses more and more often are working in partnerships like this. So the university press as a standalone entity on campus is sometimes the way it works. But more and more often, the university press is either reporting to the library, or in some cases, both of them are kind of co-reporting up to a provost or another authority figure in the administration. And there's a lot more collaboration happening between these entities right now than ever has happened before. And it's really exciting and it's really super. But whether they're doing it with a university press or not, most libraries that are publishing publish at least a journal or two. And these tend to be, again, journals that professors or students, sometimes it's even undergraduate students, come to the library and say, I want to start this edited series. How can I do that? And there's some really great platforms and tools that make this relatively easy. And librarians have some fairly well-established processes now for getting those types of workflows off the ground to support something like producing a journal. Books also, there are a number of scholars at all kinds of levels who are publishing books through library publishing environments as well. And again, you can see some of the tools over to the side, and you can click on these for yourself after this presentation if you want to. Expansive digital projects. There are all kinds of crazy, in some cases, and really cool projects out there. And one that I will brag on because I love it is slavevoyages.org, which was a project that I got to work on for a number of years that I still work on as much as I can. That grew out of a collaboration between Emory University, University of Hull in England, and 4 other universities that I won't take the time to mention. And that provides maps and archival materials and all kinds of things that don't just describe the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, but they actually reveal new things about it. And they give you ways to actually go in and watch where a voyage would have gone. So they've used the logbooks to describe what the pathway was for a boat. And then you can actually show that boat going across the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see how many people were on it, and you can see what the conditions were like and things like this. I mean, just marvelous, marvelous, deep levels of scholarship that's also public scholarship. So one of the great things with the digital projects in particular, whatever range of things that they're being published in, is that they're often available to a much broader audience than just scholars. Textbooks I talked about before, so I won't go back over that. And then data sets. There are so many fields where data is produced wildly and needs homes, needs places to sit and park, and know that somebody else can come behind you and look at that data set, or somebody else can actually use that data set and compare it with their own or combine it with other data sets. And that's not something we've published in traditional publishing. And so in digital publishing, this has become a burgeoning part of what is happening in library publishing over the course of the last really 6 to 7 years. And there is no sign of this slowing down anytime soon. So data sets are another big piece of what libraries are actively publishing. So in terms of functional roles or the day-to-day activities that library publishers do, what do those look like? So one of the things that, again, scholars and students as well as faculty members often come to the library needing is they need a way to show that what they are doing is able to be validated as real scholarship, right? And in print publications, one of the things that you have when you go to a university press, let's say, is that you have what's called blind review, which just means anonymized review. So after a scholar produces a work, that scholar will turn that in to the publisher, be that a library publisher now or a traditional publisher. And one of the things that's expected from the academic field is if you do that, that piece is now going to get sent out to several outside readers who aren't going to know whose piece it is. So they're not going to know that this book is written by Catherine Skinner. They're just going to know this is a book that needs to be reviewed. And then they're going to sit down and they're going to review it. And these are experts in the same field. And they basically vote on whether they think this should be published, whether it should be published with some changes made. They suggest changes almost always, or whether it should be denied publication. And this is a really important step in the academic process, and particularly for folks who want to be professors or want to be on that pathway. This is a necessary step in job advancement. You have to have that peer review piece. And so having publishing platforms within library publishing arenas that can actually simplify that peer review process. As you can imagine, if you're receiving a manuscript, which now comes in digital form, you've got this file. Think about files that you manage. You get that file and then you send it out to 3 reviewers. Those 3 reviewers are all using that file and are probably making marks on it. So track changes in Word, things like this often get used, or maybe they're using a PDF and they're putting comment windows all over it. And then they send it back, and somehow you have to synthesize those 3 reviewers' comments and not miss anything. And so you've gone from having 1 copy to 3 copies that now each are their own copy that need to be synthesized. This gets really complicated. It gets really messy. And so having systems and platforms that can help to manage that process and make it so that you don't lose things along that pathway are really important. Other things that are really important that library publishers provide are just hosting services, making stuff available and accessible. And again, there's a big open access leaning within not everything is open access, but there's a big leaning in that direction for library publishers. And then finally, technical setup and production. So if you can imagine for any of you who have tried to just put together a WordPress site, or for some of you who are older, like I am, there's Dreamweaver and things like that years and years ago that used to help us with web editing. It's really hard to do layout on the screen and have it hold when you move things into a website format or when you provide it through an access pathway that's using the web. And so those technical setup and layout and production pieces that make a publication look the way it's supposed to look on an iPhone or another type of mobile device, or on a large screen up on a wall in a big conference room, or on a regular computer. Those are not easy things to do. They're not something that every human being should have to do. Library publishers learn how to do that and kind of condense that process and make a lot of it happen behind the scenes for the authors. Now, as the note says on this slide, not all academic libraries have staff that do all of these things. Different library publishing programs handle these things differently and specialize differently. Other things that they do, again, when you're thinking about digital publications, one of the things that's incredibly challenging is when you cite something as a scholar, you want to make sure it's still going to be where you tell people to go and look for it. And if you think about like a 1950s newspaper, it's pretty easy to do. There's a standard way, there are multiple standard ways that you're supposed to cite what the issue number and volume number is, and what the date is, and who the author was, and what page of the newspaper it appeared on, all those kinds of things. When it's on the web, you can give a URL or that lovely little address that comes up in the bar that you also use for searching now, but things move and things change, and you don't have the same level of assurance that that information is going to stay where you tell people to go to find it. And so that's where things like DOIs, which is one of the terms in this first bullet, come from. And they're following in the footsteps of things like ISBNs and ISSNs, all these lovely acronyms that we throw around in the library world, both of which are ways of labeling books and journals with unique numbers that let the Library of Congress and the kind of national scene and international scene track these books, so that you know when a new book has been published, or you know when a new journal has been published, and they're assigned these very specific identifiers. Copyright's a really, really hard thing to deal with, and the digital space just makes it 10 times harder, because you can find so many things, but you don't know what you're allowed to use and how you're allowed to use it, et cetera. And so a lot of library publishers provide some level of copyright advice. Sometimes that's a deep specialty of people who are on staff. Sometimes people just know, sometimes the library publishers know who to consult with. So sometimes it's the expertise that is throughout the field that is being tapped into by library publishers. And then just to name one more of these, preserving and archiving the digital content in perpetuity. I read an article a couple of years ago about how there was this guy out in Ireland, and he was hiking around in the bogs, and he found a manuscript that was about, if memory serves me correctly, it was about 1,000 years old, and it was still intact. So a book that had been dropped in the bog somehow, somewhere, way back, 1,000 years before, 1,200 years before, and it was still intact, and it was preserved by the mud that had been encasing it. And so, it became one of the many big finds of, the last few generations. That's not going to happen with your Macintosh computer. If you drop your Macintosh computer in a bog and somebody finds it 1,200 years from now, they're not going to be able to see the digital content that might have been stored on it. And so preserving and archiving digital content requires an immense amount of planning and preparation and ongoing work. We don't have the luxury of assuming that some things will just stand the test of time. And many library publishers are very concerned about that piece and really trying to address it. So what are some of the competencies? If you actually want to get involved in this area, what are some of the skills that you need to be able to speak to when you are writing a cover letter, when you're showing off your CV? What are some of the skills that you need to build through either continuing education opportunities, including open opportunities like the curriculum that we've produced and some of the things that we'll be giving you, as well as through other opportunities? What do those look like? Before we go there, this is a new field. This is a brand new field. It really, the kind of seeds of this field were sown in the late 90s. In the early 2000s, it spread a little bit. Nobody called this library publishing until about 2012. So you're looking at something that's not even a full decade old yet. Nobody has all of the skills that are looked for in job ads for library publishing. So when you see an ad under some of the names that I'm about to show you, don't be put off by not having all of the skills or not being able to show all of the skills. That's not necessarily going to be a deal breaker for these kinds of jobs, because they're just too new, and the skill set is something that's still being developed in most people. So even folks like the Library Publishing Coalition, I get to have the pleasure of working with them often, and Melanie could say much more about this. But everybody's learning from each other. It's part of what makes this particular field, I think, really dynamic and really fun right now. Most of the things that you need to know, you really do learn on the job. So there's a degree of wanting to be there and then just figuring it out as you go. There's a lot of chutzpah and kind of pick it up as you go along, and Google and reach out to colleagues and all of those kinds of things that are really important. But a lot of them are based in the traditional library roles that many of us have been trained in one way or another. And then there are increasingly professional development opportunities that can help with this, and those matter a lot. And most of the times, those professional development opportunities, part of what's really valuable about them is that you get to meet the people who are doing this. They're mostly practitioner voices rather than academic voices, which is just very, very different. Many areas of continuing education, you're likely to run into professors who are great and may be able to convey a lot of stuff to you, but they don't know practitioners. They can't help you find a job in the same way that, that library publisher professional development often can. So some of the competencies, working with publishing software, there are lots of different types. So again, it's not really about having the right platform. It's about the willingness to put yourself out there, know that you don't know how it works, and then figure it out. And so again, it's a lot of like, if you can just get through that anxiety of, I don't know how this works, and get to the other side of it, then you might be a really good library publisher, because that's one of the defining traits, I think, of most people who wind up starting in this space. Publishing production, so learning some things about layout and design and how that works in a digital environment. Description and discovery, so again, this is metadata. It's things that we've learned about in other spaces and that we've experienced in other spaces, but really bringing that to bear on the very big challenge of making sure that what we put out there, especially in digital form, is actually findable, and not just findable today, but findable hopefully 500 years from now. And then finally, working with metrics. So figuring out how many people have actually opened this PDF and read it. How long did they spend with different pieces of this publication? How does that rank against others within the field? These are the kinds of things that we're starting to learn how to measure. None of us are good at it yet at all, but it is something that people are actively trying to develop right now. And so again, new area, it's an area that it's easier to break into, in part because of its newness. A lot of what happens in library publishing is project management. So the work of creating, managing, and sustaining a publishing program as a whole is a lot of administration and project management kind of things. And then so is the actual item by item production process. So organization skills, really being able to make a plan with a group of people and then stick to it so that you've got very clear, detailed processes. These are important pieces of the puzzle for library publishers. So, figuring out how do you decide what to publish, and there's a lot in the literature that we'll be giving you access to through the Google Drive that talks about the different strategies that library publishers have for deciding what do they specialize in. Is it that they specialize in particular subdisciplines, like, do they focus on gender studies and African American studies, and do they look at a particular subsection of science, or are they open to all kinds of different publications, but they only publish on certain platforms? These are some of the things that library publishers have to think through. And then things like evaluation and business modeling. So library publishers are finding that they have to figure out how to justify the investments that are made in publishing open access books and open access journals and other materials. So figuring out how do you sustain that after it's up is a big piece. And then teaching and consulting. So a lot of the things that subject liaisons do, a lot of the things that a lot of term positions are hired to do in terms of advocacy for new things, also are really, really big for library publishers, because part of our job in library publishing is really to spread the word about why library publishing is out here, to let the campus know that it's a resource that they can use, and to really help to train up the next generation through starting with the students, and really working with the students and working in partnership with the students who sometimes have really great ideas that can come back and feed our programs. So there's also this willingness to recognize that expertise doesn't mean the same thing as it did in a world 4 decades ago, that sometimes the greatest expertise and innovation is happening with young people who are coming up through our environments, rather than those of us that think we already have it all worked out. So what does the job market look like? And we'll wind down in just a moment, so there will be some time for questions. So there are a lot of library administrative units that get involved in publishing. And when you're looking for a job in this area, there are a number of different ways that you can do it, but you've got to cast a fairly broad net in looking at job announcements and other things, because these types of units pop up in different places. Sometimes they're embedded in the library itself. Sometimes they're embedded in the university press. Sometimes they're even embedded in these kind of center for digital scholarship spaces. So like the Emory Center for Digital Scholarship, which is one that I'm familiar with because that was one of my homes for a long time. Also IUPUI has a Center for Digital Scholarship. This is not an uncommon thing. But, you know, watching the big picture of the academic space isn't something that a lot of librarians think to do. And you can miss these positions if you're only looking at library listings. Some of the job titles that you might see are things like publishing librarian. That usually means that it is parked within the library or it's in collaboration with the library. And, you know, it's highly collaborative. So if you note the words that are highlighted here, one of the things you're going to see is collaboration gets highlighted over and over again. It's a really good thing to base your job letter for any of these positions in part on the ways that you partner well with other people in your daily work, whatever it is that you're doing, or the ways that you've experimented with that as a student, etc. Scholarly communication librarian, that position, again, especially if it has the word librarian at the end, often is in conjunction with the library, but it is often hosted within digital scholarship centers. So again, you've got to, you know, kind of broaden your lens on where you're looking. And again, highly collaborative, often about things like content creation, delivery, discovery, and analysis, really managing the platforms and the tools and the processes that help faculty and students do that. Publishing specialist or production manager, production assistant. Note that those last two don't say publishing. So some of these things, again, they won't be on your radar unless you've had exposure to scholarly communications and to this area. These tend to be groups of employees that are really looking at how to make a publication go from start to finish. So all of the little sub-steps in the production process, from the time that the manuscript is received, usually as a digital file, it's sent out for review, how is it processed, how is it edited, how are citations managed, how is it finally put up and put out? These are the things that those production managers and assistants often are working on. And then open education librarian. Again, nothing there about publishing, but open education librarians are often the ones that are really leading the charge for open textbooks and other things in that kind of arena. And those are also called OER librarians. So that's open educational resources. Again, we're so bad about acronyms in this room. And then open education coordinator. These are titles to keep an eye out for. They're often really wonderful opportunities to start working in the open textbook space, which is another brand new space. Journals coordinator, repository coordinator. Again, you know, these are labels for content types. And if you didn't know better, you might think the journals coordinator is just coordinating all those subscription journals at the library that you subscribe to from other places. Not so. It's somebody who's actually coordinating the production sometimes of these publications. And then finally, there are lots of term positions. Those always come with the caveat that they're short term and you have to be going after them because you want experience, not because you necessarily are going to get to have a long-term career in these. And so I always have a little grain of salt around term positions, but they are a really great way to get experience if you're able to get involved in these. And keep an eye out for some of the collaboratives, including the Library Publishing Coalition, which are often hiring in a virtual landscape that don't require you to move, which is the biggest thing that's a real problem with term positions, where many people don't have the luxury of just being able to pick up and move. So if you want to become a library publisher, things you can do to get started. One, take a self-directed course. We're going to provide you this link. You'll have it again after the session. This is a set of materials that we have assembled that we think are pretty good for just introductory work on this topic. And if you finish that course and you're still interested, then call us. So reach out to me and Melanie, and we'll do an interview with you, and we'll find out what you're interested in and what pieces of this are most important to you. And we will help link you up with real library publishers who share your interests and who will help you get to the next level. And then don't forget to explore LPC's resources, this Library Publishing Coalition. Again, you'll have this slide, you'll be able to play with it. And that moves us to questions. So I'm sorry that we only have about 7 minutes left for questions, but I'm available, Melanie is available. You have our email addresses, use them, get in touch with us if you don't get a chance to ask your question right now. I am going to stop the recording for the questions so that people don't have to worry about that piece. So for those who are listening to the recording, thank you very much. And again, use my email address, use Melanie's email address.